The latest scandal to engulf this president. Good evening, John.
Hi, Keith.
Mr. Bush's defenders on this have said, in fact, he himself has quoted Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. He says that it gives him the authority, requires him to protect this country in any way necessary. Is that absolute?
Well, I've never read Article 2 quite as broadly as it's being read now, and I've often thought what would have happened if Richard Nixon had said, well, you know, what this is really about is my commander-in-chief power. That's why I'm breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's office to see if he's passing out these Pentagon Papers to the communists. That's a parallel argument. It was probably the best defense that Nixon might have made, but he actually didn't even go that far.
I can remember well, though, that President Nixon's rationalization, and this was in the David Frost interviews 3 years after the resignation, on all of this was, if the president does it, then it is not illegal. Is there a legal or constitutional support for that idea? Is there something in how Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and ignored the Supreme Court during the Civil War that gives the president the right to define an emergency and declare what's necessary to deal with that emergency all by himself?
There's no question a president has what they call prerogative powers, and that's what Nixon was talking about with Frost. In fact, they were talking specifically about Lincoln in that exchange. And it's a long-held belief that, indeed, it goes all the way back to John Locke's thinking on executive powers, that there are inherent powers that nobody will put into a constitution, that in case of an emergency, the president can exercise those prerogative powers. What's interesting, Keith, is every time a president does exercise his prerogative powers, he tends to get himself in trouble, whether it be JFK with the Bay of Pigs, whether it be Eisenhower with U-2 flights, whether it be Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson escalating Vietnam without congressional clearance, and Nixon's actions himself. They all seem to get in trouble when they go into this area, and we see it again today.
You quoted in your book, Justice Brennan, after each perceived security crisis ended, the United States has remorsefully realized that the abrogation of civil liberties was unnecessary. It would be I think it would still be hard in many, many places, even in those areas in which the president is most fiercely criticized for this, to envision some scenario in which the terror issue will not sustain historical analysis. Do you suspect that this will be merely lumped in there with the Red Scare of the 1920s and the subsequent one of the 1950s and all the other reasons that the Constitution has been nudged aside for a time?
Well, we don't have all the facts on this, and I don't think anybody's going to fault the president in his goal. The ends are certainly appropriate. He's trying to protect Americans from the threat of a terrorist attack or the actual attack. No one can slight that. It's the means that he's employed. Why, for example, hasn't he gone to Congress? If he's been doing this for 4 years now. We've learned from the very first report that he didn't have in place initially protections. This is something they put in 2004, thinking that, well, if John Kerry does slip by, we could be in criminal trouble, so we'll put some protections in here, at least to look like we were doing it cautiously and carefully in protecting liberties. But it was an afterthought. So why didn't anybody take care of this in 4 years? Why couldn't Congress? I haven't heard a good argument why Congress couldn't indeed have dealt with this issue.
There's also a kind of backwards way of looking at this that was put in the electronic surveillance question that was put by a constitutional law professor quoted by the New York Times, who asked, in essence, if the Constitution directly authorized this kind of stuff, why would we even have this foreign intelligence surveillance court to review wiretap requests? If Mr. Bush can just do this, or any president can just do this, why doesn't he just do this all the time by himself? Why have the court?
Well, it does happen that we are a government of laws, and theoretically at least. And why do we need a Patriot Act if he has all these powers? If anyone reads the Article 2 the way Bush does, Cheney, his former counsel David Addington, and John Yoo do, there are just no powers they don't have in the name of defending the country against terrorism. And terrorism is an indefinite threat, therefore they can do anything indefinitely that they wish. That isn't what I think the Constitution contemplates.
Put all this together for me. Are the president's actions authorizing the NSA to spy internally in this country, are they illegal, and do they in fact right now constitute an impeachable offense?
Well, I don't think there's any question he's violated the law. He's admitted to violating the law. What he is saying, I have a good defense, and that is national security. I have this power to do this, or this very vague resolution that the Congress granted for my using force in dealing with Afghanistan and terrorists. I can read into that it also includes collecting signal intelligence. It's a stretch. So what does this all mean? Is it an impeachable offense? Keith, that is a purely political question, and only the House of Representatives can decide it in the first instance. And I don't think they're going to decide it against the president at this point.
2 years ago, when you were writing your book, Worse Than Watergate, you entitled a chapter Scandals or Worse, and you listed 11 specific areas where trouble might be brewing, and then you wrote less specifically about 2 other areas of concern. Let me just review those 13 points, if you will, quickly here. 1, character issues would be Mr. Bush's past conduct, service record, and whatnot. 2, his prior business conduct, how to get a company and your own ball club without really trying or paying. Number 3, whether or not the vice president had been truthful about his own health. Number 4, Mr. Cheney's past business conduct. Hello, Halliburton. 5, the possibility of civil rights violations in keeping protesters out of the Bush and Cheney events. 6, the president's executive order dismantling the Presidential Records Act. 7, those pesky little national energy policy development meetings that Mr. Cheney had chaired. 8, the president's effort to prevent a 9/11 commission. 9, the failure to update the continuity of government plan. 10, the possible misleading of Congress about Iraq. 11, the leaking of Valerie Plame's name by the White House. And then, as I said, less formally, 12, what you quoted Orrin Gross as saying, terrorism presents its real threat in provoking democratic regimes to embrace and employ authoritarian measures. Sounds kind of like a forecast of this NSA spying story. And lastly of this group here, efforts by Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney to expand the powers of the presidency. I'm gathering that 2 years later, you'd probably say we should be watching numbers 10 through 13 most closely, or is there something new on the list?
I think 10 through 13 would be a good place to start, and I think if for example, the composition of the Congress changes in the House or the Senate in 2006, it's going to be Katie bar the door. This administration has an awful lot of things they're going to have to explain. I think this is coming right out of the Vice President's office, Keith, and he sold the President on what to do. This is something that Dick Cheney's wanted to do since he left the White House as Chief of Staff, and he's about doing it now, and he's doing it with a vengeance. And I'm not sure the Congress is going to tolerate it if they lose control of the Congress.
Well, to that point, obviously a Republican Congress will not be impeaching a Republican president, so the fall midterm elections have already, it's no news here to say they're shaping up as a referendum on the president. But apply your political experience and your impeachment experience here. If you're the Republicans, are you best advised to embrace this now, to say, hey, vote Republican this fall, or the Democrats will impeach George W. Bush?
I think it's dangerous for some Republicans, and I think some Republicans have realized that. They don't want to. They didn't want to, for example, have a vote if they could avoid it on many of these controversial issues. They're trying to avoid them right now like a plague. They know the politics of this. They know the American people do not like to lose their civil liberties. It's still a story that is just starting to catch on and be broadly embraced and understood. It's a complex story, but people do get wiretapping. That's one of those issues they understand. Richard Nixon was impeached for it. He claimed national security. The Congress said no national security. I think we got a parallel situation.
Nixon White House counsel and FindLaw.com columnist John Dean, author of Worse Than Watergate, which is now a much easier read because much of what he said might happen in there has happened. As always, sir, great thanks for your time and your insight.
Thank you, Keith.